Hello everyone, this is Laura Flagg, Program Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Water Loss Audits. You've collected your data. How do you know if it's any good? Here with me today, I have Heather Himmelberger, as well as Dawn Nall from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Heather will be your presenter today, so welcome, Heather.
Hi, welcome.
So before Heather gets started, I just wanted to let everyone know I'll be providing some technical support for today's session. Please take a moment to observe your GoToWebinar control panel. Most of the functions are self-explanatory, but I'd like to draw your attention to the questions section on your control panel. During today's session, you will all be kept on mute to ensure audio quality and to minimize background noise. Should you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time. We will be holding all questions until the end of today's presentation to ensure that we end on time. We have over 180 registrants for the webinar today, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Today's presenter has consented to share her presentation slide with you, and we will make the slides available as well as a video recording following the webinar on the EFCN website. And this website can be accessed at efcnetwork.org. Please allow 1 week for the processing and posting of these materials. So just to give you an idea of where others on the webinar are tuning in from, we've prepared this map. As you can see, we have attendees spread all throughout the country as well as internationally in Canada. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And quickly before I turn the presentation over to Heather, we have a couple poll questions for everyone. First, I will be launching right now. And we just wanted to see what kind of water and or sewer utility you represent. So we have the selections below. Select one of the following for-profit, municipality, not-for-profit, special purpose district, or not a water or sewer utility. And I'll just give a couple of seconds for people to be able to submit their answers. All right. So it looks like just under half are not a water or sewer utility, and the majority of people after that are a municipality. So one more poll question. And this is, what size water and or sewer system does your utility operate by number of people served? We have the options of very small, small, medium, large, or very large with the numbers of people next to it. And then again, not a water or sewer utility. So I'll give a couple more seconds for everyone to send in their answers. All right. And again, the majority of people, or just under the majority, are not a water or sewer utility. And it looks like we have pretty equal between small, medium, and large or very large. So at this moment, I will now turn the presentation over to Heather. Welcome, Heather.
All right. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar, and thank you, Laura, for helping us today. All right, there we go. So first thing, I wanted to just thank EPA for helping us fund this project. This is part of the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project that is funded, as I said, by the Environmental Protection Agency. And it's funding that was provided to the Environmental Finance Center Network to allow us to help small water utilities with managerial and financial capacity issues. And by small, in this particular context, we mean less than 10,000 population. I know that there are various definitions of small, medium, and large, but in this case, we can help any water utility that's less than 10,000 people, and that's over 90% of the water utilities fall into that category. So that's quite a bit of folks that we can assist. And for anybody who joined us after the beginning, I just want to make reference to the chat box. And again, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll handle as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. So just a reminder there. As Laura mentioned, our website is efcnetwork.org that you see at the bottom of the screen, and the picture that you see in the slide right now is what the website will look like when you click on efcnetwork.org. So you can check out our workshops and webinars and see everything that's upcoming, and also check out any past recorded webinars under that Workshops and Webinars tab. And I do want to let people know that you don't have to stick to workshops that are within your state. If you're ever interested in a workshop that's in a neighboring state, or you might be traveling through or visiting family in another state, you're always welcome to attend our workshops in any state. It doesn't matter if it's your home state or not. So feel free to look down the list, especially if you're in a border area where you might actually be closer to a workshop that's in another state instead of your own state. So feel free to look through those and go to any workshop that you would like, and you're always welcome to sign in to any of our webinars. We have lots of slots available, so if you're ever interested in a webinar, on any topic, please feel free to listen in. We also have a resources tab that has quite a few resources, pretty much all free resources for managerial and financial. Some of them are EFC network resources, and some of those are other organizations' resources. So please check it out for any managerial and financial resources that might help you. We have a blog portion of our website now, and you're welcome to read and or subscribe to our blog posts on managerial and financial topics. And finally, I wanted to make reference to the request for technical assistance section. So if you look at the tab that says assistance and you click on that, a form will come up that will allow you to fill in your information and the type of assistance you would like. That will get sent in to the Environmental Finance Center network, and we will process your request and send it out to somebody who can help you. And we will try to help as many people as we can. Again, our particular funding is restricted to water utilities less than 10,000 in population. It's not restricted to any type of water utility, so it doesn't matter if you're for-profit or not. As long as you're a water utility that's 10,000 or less, we should be able to help you. And I apologize for anybody above 10,000 or somebody who's a wastewater utility. This particular funding will not allow us to help you, but you're welcome to fill out the request form anyway, and if there's a way that we can assist you under another funding source, we might do that. But this particular funding source is for water utilities. The topics included for assistance are collaboration, working with other utilities, asset management, energy efficiency, water loss, water rates and finance, access to different funding sources, and a new topic, workforce development. There may be something that you see that is not listed here. If it's a managerial or financial topic and you think it's applicable, go ahead and send us the request. But these are the primary areas that we're working with in this project. So with that short introduction, I want to move on to water loss audits. And you've collected your data. How do you know if it's any good, which is today's topic. So part one is a quick review of the AWWA water audit methodology. And I want to mention that we've actually had several webinars in the past on water loss and water auditing and all of that sort of thing. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the basic water balance today. There are several webinars that you can listen to get that background information. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page about what we meant by water balance. So what you see on screen here is the AWWA standard water balance, and this is kind of the gold standard for both national and international water auditing, and this is about putting water in its particular categories. So the goal is that we will not have any unaccounted for water anymore. So in the past, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, you would hear terminology that said, how much is your unaccounted for water? We really want to get away from that terminology. We've learned a lot, and we've really would like to have all the water fall into various categories, because that allows us to better respond to what's actually happening in our system. So if you ever hear anybody saying no unaccounted for water, you can politely tell them that, hey, that's old terminology, we don't do that anymore. We do a water balance to try to figure out where our water is going. So within the balance, there are two areas that are of most interest to us, and one is non-revenue water, So in the yellow box are highlighted the areas that are considered non-revenue water. And quite simply, this is all the water that you put into your system for which you receive no revenue. So it's water you're supplying, but nobody is paying for it. And that includes the categories of unbilled authorized consumption, apparent losses, and real losses. And we'll talk about what each of those are in just a moment. And real losses can be distinguished from, water losses can be distinguished from non-revenue water by unbilled authorized consumption. So the unbilled authorized consumption is the difference between the non-revenue water and water loss. So you'll hear both of those terms when you talk about water auditing. You'll talk about non-water and water loss. So just remember they're not exactly the same. The difference is what we don't bill, but we allow people to use. So let's spend just a moment talking about the categories that make up non-revenue water. So the first category is unbilled authorized consumption. So this is water that we allow people to use, but we're not sending them a bill. So the type of water that might be in this category is a municipal use. Maybe you're watering a park, maybe you have water going to City Hall. That type of use would be unbilled and authorized. It might be your firefighting folks, where you're not charging the fire department, but you're authorizing, of course, them to use the water. It also includes water that the municipality or the water utility uses as well. So it could be flushing water or processed water. So all of that water would fall into the category where you're not billing, but you're allowing somebody to use. Apparent losses have three different pieces. One is customer meter inaccuracy. So typically customer meters, when they become inaccurate, read low. So when the customer meter reads low, that means the customer is getting more water than they're actually paying you for. So maybe it's reading several gallons less than what you're actually billing them for. So you're not getting the revenue, but they are getting the water. The second category in there is data handling errors. So if there's something wrong with how your data is being processed, maybe your SCADA system is inaccurately delivering the information or wasn't programmed correctly, or maybe you're transposing numbers or the right information is not getting to your billing system. So anything with the data that you have would show up here as well. And the third category is water theft. So if somebody is stealing water from your system, and they could be stealing it by taking out the meter, replacing with a pipe, putting the meter backwards, connecting up to your system illegally, any of those things. And people are extremely creative. I know many of you out there probably have really good stories about water theft. And they also could be taking it out of fire hydrants. So any people who are stealing water, they're taking water out of your system, they're using it, but they're not paying you for it. So all of those types of losses show up in apparent losses because they're, quote, on paper, but it's not water that's leaving the system. It's water that people are using and they're not giving you revenue for. The final category is real losses. So real losses is actually the only portion of the water balance where we have water leaving the system and not being used by anybody. So this is water that's leaking from our services, leaking from our water mains, or leaking or overflowing at our water storage tanks. So this is water leaving the system. The free water audit software can be downloaded from the American Water Works Association. You will be asked to register, but whether you're a member of AWWA or not, you can register and you can download the software. We do have the website here. And version 5 is the version you want. It gets updated every couple of years. And it will look like this when you download it. It is a spreadsheet that's based on Excel, so you will need to have Excel on your computer. If you have an extremely old version of Excel, it may not perform quite right. If that happens, just try to find a newer computer. Maybe you have to go to excuse me, go to a library or somewhere else to find a computer that has a newer version of Excel. But primarily it will run on almost all recent Excel versions, and it again will look like this when you pull it up. So the place to start is on the instructions worksheet. You'll notice several tabs when you open up the software. Many of those tabs background information for you, helpful tips and that sort of thing. There's only a couple places where you actually have to add information yourself. And the first one is the instructions sheet. And the instruction sheets is where you're going to put in your identifying information, contact information, and then you're going to select the year. It can either be a fiscal year or a calendar year. You can choose either one, but once you choose that, you should stick with that from that point forward to make it easier for you to compare one year to the next. If you pick a fiscal year or financial year, it will ask you your start and end dates for the audit. And then finally, you're going to have to pick your reporting units. So basically what you want the water audit to read in. Millions of gallons is probably the most common, but there are a couple of other choices for megaliters and acre feet. So you choose the units that you want the whole water audit to be done in. So the first page is just a couple of data entry points. The next one is the reporting worksheet, which is where you're going to be entering all of your volume inputs and financial inputs. So this is primarily where you'll enter all of your information for the water audit. So poll question 1, we can go ahead and open. And this is going to be a question that will ask you about whether or not you've done a water audit. So a couple of choices you have is yes, I have done a water audit using the AWWA free water audit software. The second choice is yes, using some other process but not the AWWA methodology. Third choice is not yet, but we're working on it now. Fourth choice is no, you haven't done a water audit, and then the fifth choice is that you're not a water utility. So take a moment and click in your answer there.
We have some answers still coming in, so I'm just going to give a couple more seconds. All right.
Okay, so it looks like about 22% have already done a water audit using the software and 21% have done using something else. So that's almost half of us have done some kind of process with water auditing, and that's great. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation now. Part 2 is where do your data inputs come from? So we talked about the fact that on the reporting worksheet you have to enter your data. So where do we get these values from? So we're going to start with the left-hand side of the audit, and you'll notice that each of these columns is exactly the same height, and the idea of the water balance is that all of the columns add up to the same amount. So we start on the left-hand side, we start with where our water is coming from, working over to the right, which tells us where our water is going, and each column adds up to the same amount, which is how we balance, and the reason is called a water balance, so that we're trying to balance the same numbers across the board. So we start with our own sources and water imported, which become the most important inputs. And you can see again when we talk about the fact that we're balancing across the way, these values will set the amount for the whole rest of the audit. So if these data points are wrong, it will flaw your entire audit. So these are the ones that are the most critical or most important to having an accurate water audit. So where might our data come from if we're talking about our own sources? Typically we have master meter records that we're going to use for that information. And that could be a well, it could be a spring, it could be a surface water source, and hopefully you have some way to meter each of your sources. And it's best if every single source has its own meter rather than having several sources coming together into one meter, because you really want to know from a process standpoint exactly what's happening at each well. Hopefully you're taking some kind of daily readings as the best case scenario. If not, maybe it's weekly or monthly. Hopefully it's no less often than monthly. And then what we want to do is take all of those values and add them up to get one number for the total amount of water that we're supplying for our system. So we want to know the entire year, what are the millions of gallons that we produce from all of our own sources, which could be several wells, it could be springs, it could be surface sources, it could be a combination of all of those, and we want to total them all up and say what is the one value, the total millions of gallons for the year. So what are some possible concerns with this data? If the meter is having heavy use, if it's got a lot of wear on it, it may not be reading accurately, it may be reading too much or too little. The meter application is another concern. Perhaps we have the wrong meter, we have a meter that's designed for a different application and we put it in the wrong place and it's just not going to read well for us. Another possibility is that we've installed it incorrectly, and typically meters want to have some straight pipe before and after them. A rule of thumb is about 10 diameters of straight pipe in the front and 5 diameters in the back. So if your meter is not having straight pipe at the beginning and end, but rather it has an elbow, it has a valve, it has something right up against it, it may not be accurately reading the flow. So even though the meter itself might be fine, the application or the installation that it's in will make it so that it's not reading the flow properly. And then the last one we need to worry about is data handling. Do we have the SCADA system sending our information correctly? Is somebody recording the results correctly? Are we making any mistakes with our data handling? Do we have a spreadsheet where all the columns aren't adding up correctly? So we have all of those possibilities for why our data may not be correct. So another input we need is the water we import. If we're buying water from another utility or a wholesaler, same kind of idea, we would want to know how much water that is, and we would get that information the same way through master meters. Maybe we're reading them, maybe the system that's supplying the water is reading them. We want to make sure that we have the correct information there regarding the master meter. Same kinds of concerns. We have meter wear, meter application, meter installation, and data handling. So the same sort of issues will come up with our water imported. We mentioned how there could be incorrect information for our master meters, both our own sources and our water imported. So we can account for those errors if we know what they are. So the meter can be overreading or underreading, meaning it's reading too much water or too little water. And we can test our meters. We can have somebody come in and check them, see how far off they are, and then we can enter a number into the software to correct for the meter errors. Similarly to some of the other portions of the software, you can only enter one number, so we would use a flow weighted average if we have multiple meters and we know what the error of all the meters are. We would use a flow weighted average to get one value for how far off our master meters are. So where would we enter these input values in our software? This would be in the water supplied section of our software. You see a value there for a block there for volume from own sources and water imported. And you would enter again the total for the year for the volume of your own sources and water imported. And then over on the right, we have the opportunity to enter those errors that we talked about. You can either enter the percent that it's off or the value in terms of numbers of millions of gallons that it's incorrect. And it will automatically calculate in the yellow box. It will take into consideration your amount of error to calculate the water supplied value. We also need a value for the water we export. So if we actually export water to another utility through a master meter, we would want to know what that master meter reading is for the year and how much water. And that allows us to calculate the total amount of water we supply to our system. So we add our own sources to the amount of water we import. We subtract out the amount of water we export, and that equals the total amount of water we supply to our customers. So again, when we put in our export values along with our volume from own sources and imported, this yellow box right here will calculate how much water we're supplying. So in this software, anytime you see a white box, you have an opportunity to input information. Anytime you see a yellow box, that's a place where the software will calculate a value for you. Some other inputs we need are billed metered consumption. So this value represents the water we're supplying to our customers. We're billing them for it, we're metering for it, so the little meters in front of a commercial customer or a meter in front of a house. This is that flow that we're talking about. This value most likely comes from a billing system, billing software. You will have to become friends with whoever at your utility deals with that billing process. You're going to have to manipulate the data somewhat because billing software was set up to bill. It was not set up to do water auditing. Maybe as water auditing gets more popular in the future, they'll change billing software so that it's more amenable to helping you get the right information you need for your audit. But at this current time, you really have to do a little bit of work to get the value that you want. So you're going to work with your billing folks to get out the total amount of water that they have billed for the year. The next one is billed unmetered consumption. So this flow would be folks that you send a bill to but you do not meter. So if your utility does not meter any customers, all of the customers would end up here. If your system bill meters several customers and some who aren't metered, you would have people in both categories. If you have stop meters where you estimate, that could show up in billed unmetered consumption. This value is going to be a little difficult for you to come by. You're going to have to do some estimating based on, say, what you know about other customers who are metered, or you can use some industry standards based on the number of faucets or the number of people in the house or the type of industry. So this value would have to be estimated the best way possible, and it will cause an error in your system because you won't know you haven't metered the full amount of water. It's something to think about whether you should have meters or could have meters, or at least maybe meter district areas or something to try to get a better handle on what this value of water is. Next we have unbilled metered consumption. So these are folks that we meter but we don't bill them. So the types of customers that might end up here are customers who, say a municipal customer, we're giving water to City Hall. We have a meter so we know how much water City Hall is getting, but we're not billing them. Or we're watering a golf course for the public but we're not sending a bill for it. Or we're watering a park. Maybe the fire department, maybe we meter them but we don't send them a bill. So it's anybody who doesn't get a bill but we know the meter amount of flow. This value would come from possibly your billing software because they may be entering the information and just have a code that says it's not being billed, or perhaps you have separate software, spreadsheet, paper forms where you keep this information. So you're going to have to look to see where you keep your unbilled metered records. And finally we have our unbilled unmetered consumption. What we need to ask ourselves to figure out whether it fits into this category is the use authorized? Are we permitting whoever's using that water to use it? The answer to that question has to be yes. The next question we want to ask is the use metered? Do we have a meter on it? The answer to that one should be no. And then the third question is the use billed? And the answer should be no. So if you can say it is authorized but it is not billed, it is not metered, it's all going to fall into this unbilled, unmetered consumption. It's a little bit more difficult to come up with what these values are. It's typically processed water, it might be the fire department, things of that nature, flushing. So it's a little harder for you, at least initially, to figure out what these values are. So there is a default value in the software that you don't have to use more sophisticated estimating techniques at a beginning stage. You can just go ahead and use the software. So where do these inputs get entered? Right here under authorized consumption, you'll see the billed metered, billed unmetered, unbilled metered flow. And then the unbilled unmetered actually gets entered over to the right. As I said, you could use the default, which is 1.25%, or you can enter your own value. You would just click this circle to be able to use a value instead of the default percentage. The defaults show up in gray. You cannot change the default values. So if you don't want to use the default, you have to click this button and use a value over here. Other inputs that are needed are unauthorized consumption. This is water theft. This value either has to be estimated the best way you can, or you can use a default. And again, this is people who are stealing water from your system. Customer meter inaccuracies is another data point that you have to enter. You only enter one percentage. Generally it's from 1 to 10%, and it has to cover what you think the overall average meter inaccuracies are from your system. And typically you're going to get this by actually pulling a statistical sample from your utility, looking at different ages and flow ranges and types of meters in your system, check them, see what the errors are, and come up with an average value. And then the systematic data handling errors are the last one of these types of inputs. You can use a default value if you don't really know that much about what the errors are in your system with data. So where do these go? Unauthorized consumption shows up over here. You can again use the default value, or you can toggle to this button and use a regular value of total millions of gallons. For the customer meter inaccuracies, you'll see it in a red. You'll enter a number from 1 to 10% in that red box, or you can switch to over here and enter millions of gallons. And then finally, data handling errors either is 0.25%, or we can put in a value. So how does the software come up with non-revenue water? It takes that total system input that it calculated, subtracts out any water we export, subtracts out our billed meter consumption, and subtracts out our billed unmetered consumption, and then it comes up with a total value for non-revenue water. The non-revenue water, just as a repeat, includes unbilled authorized, apparent losses, and real losses. So our unbilled authorized consumption, again, is our unbilled metered use and unbilled unmetered use. Apparent is unauthorized consumption, customer meter inaccuracies, and systematic data handling errors. And our real losses are leakage on mains, leakage on service, and leakage and overflows at storage tanks. The real losses are calculated as a calculation. There is nowhere in the software where you are going to enter an estimate of your total leaks in your system or how many breaks you fixed or anything like that. The way this works is it gets to the real water losses by looking at the other inputs that you made, and it calculates it. So it takes our total system input, subtracts out all the authorized consumption, subtracts out our apparent losses, and then that will give us the value for real losses. That's why things like the total system input and those beginning numbers are so important, because the real losses are going to be based on that information that we initially input. If we're way off on our total system input, it will either make the real losses higher or lower than what is actually happening, and that can really throw us off. So where do these values show up? The non-revenue water will show up as a calculated value in the software, and the authorized consumption will show up, total authorized consumption there, apparent losses will show up here, and real losses show up there. So all of these values will be calculated for you. Once you input all the information in the software, it will calculate these values for you and let you know what's happening in your system. There are a few other inputs that you have to enter. Some of these are system data type issues like length of mains, number of connections, customer service, curb stop locations, and average operating pressure. And the average operating pressure is one number for the whole system. You may have several pressure zones in your system. If that's the case, there are ways that AWWA has methods that you can use to try to figure out an average operating pressure across the whole system. And then finally, we have to enter some financial information, which includes the total annual cost of operating the system, the customer retail unit cost, and the variable production cost. The customer retail unit cost is what's going to be used to value how much the apparent losses are costing you. And that's going to be based on what you charge on a per 1,000 gallon basis for your utility, for your customers. And the variable production cost is going to be related to what it costs you to make that next increment of water. So we typically only consider chemical cost and electric cost because all those other costs are sunk into your system, and you're going to have to pay them anyway, whether you're creating 20 million gallons or 21 million gallons. So we're just looking at, well, what do you have to spend if you're going to create 1 more million gallons? You're going to have to spend some money on chemicals and some money on electricity. So the variable production costs will only include those. You're going to need some supporting documents to help you complete the audit. So the monthly water supply volume is important. The production meter testing results, if you've actually done those. The water volumes sold by rate codes by month, the retail rate schedule for the audit year that you're doing, and what you spent on power and chemicals. A few other documents that would be good to have: your customer meter testing results. If you've actually performed those, you really need to know what the results were, your pressure data so you can do that average pressure, the quantities of your unbilled unmetered flow so you can move away from the default value and move to a more system-specific value, and then line break data. Now this data is not used in the audit but can help you sort of judge the real loss values that come out of your audit, and you can use it for lots of other things. So while we won't enter this directly into the audit, it's still very important information to collect and will really help you as you go forward in implementing water loss. So part 3 is looking at that validity and developing your data grades. So we've entered information about different values in our system, and basically we don't know that much about how good that data is or how confident we should be in it or how much stock we should put in the results. So we kind of need some help to let us know how good the information is in our audit. So the data grades actually show up in these little boxes to the left of your data entry. So these little tiny boxes that you see next to all the input values. So here's an input value, and we want to give it a data grade. So how would we know what data grade to put in the little box? Well, one way is we hover over the little red triangle in the corner. So up in the upper right-hand corner of the data grades, there's a little red triangle. If we hover our cursor over that red triangle, up will pop a pop-up box that tells us from not applicable to 10 what the data grade should be. And we have to read each of these conditions. We have to meet all those conditions to be able to say that we are that particular data grade. The pop-up boxes can be a little hard to read and use because you have to make sure that all 10 numbers are showing up, and you have to be clear on what the different categories are. So we've actually developed some spreadsheets to kind of help you select the right data grade. It's the same information as just presented a little differently. So it's taking that information saying, what are the 2 things that I have to meet to be a number 1, or what are the 3 things I have to meet to be a grade 6. So it's just a different formatting of the same information to try to make it a little bit easier for you to pick out the right data grade. There is one sheet for each data input, so it's very important to check what the data input is for. And they're not the same, they're completely different. So you have to look and say, okay, if I'm doing volume from own sources, I need the sheet that's specifically for volume from own sources. And the data grades are related to practices, policies, and procedures at your water system. So for example, the data grade for volume of own sources is related to 3 different things, which include the percent of water production sources that are metered, the meter accuracy testing and electronic calibration of those master meters, and then the accuracy of the meter itself. So it's going to be asking you questions about these 3 things to figure out what your data grade is for volume from own sources. Another example, the data grade for billed metered is related to whether the customers receive volume-based billing, the meter reading practices, and meter records data handling practices, and meter replacement practices. So there's 4 different things that the data grade for billed metering is related to. You can actually choose any starting point on the data grades, because if you meet or exceed the criteria, you're going to check the box. If you don't meet or exceed the criteria, you're going to leave the box unchecked. There's a couple of these data grades that may be worded a little funky, and you have to really think about, do I meet or exceed the criteria? If you exceed the criteria, you can still check the box. So for example, this one says less than 25% of water production meters sources are metered, remaining are estimated. And some people get confused because you think you can't check the box if more than 25. So just remember that if it's meet or exceed, you can check the box. So if you have less than 25%, you check it. If you have more than 25%, you check it. If you're able to check each of the boxes for that number, you can move up to the next highest number. If you can't meet or exceed all the criteria in the box, you're going to move down to the next lower number. There are a few cases where it has a conditions between one number and another number. In those cases, if you can check all the boxes for the lower number, in this case 2, and some of the boxes for the higher number, in this case 4, you would choose the condition 3, which is the condition between 2 and 4. So you can see I've met all of 2, 1 of 4, so I'm going to be a number 3. If you're at 2, you've checked all the boxes, but you're not able to check any of the boxes for 4, you can't be a 3, you have to be a 2. So the only way to be conditioned between two numbers is if you can check at least one of the boxes above. So in this particular case, the utility is a 2, not a 3 for that particular data grade. So here's an example. We're going to vote here. If you saw this particular data grading worksheet, with all of these boxes checked, 2 of the boxes in 6 and all the boxes up to that point, what data grade would this system have? So just take a couple of seconds and try to formulate your answer, because when we open the polling question, this particular picture will not be in front of you. So try to decide what data grade you would give this particular system. And if you would, please open the poll. So in this case, you can choose 4, 5, 6, or you're not sure. So just take a moment and put in whichever one you think would best fit that utility. Okay, it looks like most people got the correct answer. In this particular case, all the boxes on 4 were checked. Oh, and you can go back to the presentation, sorry. All of the boxes on 4 were checked, and 2 of the boxes on 6 were checked, so this particular utility would be a 5. So even though they checked 2 of the 3 boxes for the 6, they are not a 6, they're still a 5. We'll have one more. This one's a little trickier, so take a look at the boxes that are checked over here on the left, and take a moment to look at this particular utility and try to see if you can figure out what data grade this particular utility should have. Okay, how about we open the poll now. So you can choose 2, 3, 4, 6, or 8.
Just giving a couple more seconds. People are still voting.
Okay, we did pretty well on that one. A little more confusion. This one was a little bit trickier, but most people picked the 3. Let's go back to the presentation. So in this case, all the boxes in number 2 were checked, and one of the boxes in 4. So this system is a data grade 3. So what was a little bit trickier in this case, that we were actually able to check one of the boxes on 6 and one of the boxes on 8. So you might have been a little confused thinking that it was a higher data grade because they did have at least something checked. But you remember, it has to be all the boxes in that particular data grade must be checked, not just some of them. So this particular utility would be a 3. Again, we enter the data grades in the little boxes to the left. So everywhere where you have an input, you have to put a data grade. You notice in this particular audit there were 2 blanks because we didn't import or export water from this utility. So we don't have to put a data grade in those cases where we don't have a value. You're welcome to put not applicable if you would like, but you can also just leave it blank. But everywhere where you enter data, including master meter errors over here, you're going to have to put a data grade for each one of those. So now the question is, what is the right data grade? Knowing that each one of them goes from 1 to 10, is it the number 10 is the right data grade, number higher than 5, number higher than 7, or any number as long as it represents the true situation? So we have a poll question up. If you can just take a moment and choose the answer that you think best fits your situation, or what best fits what the right data grade is. All right, most everybody got the right answer, which is any number as long as it reflects the true situation. So we can go back to the presentation now. So the most important thing is to be as honest about the right data grades as possible. You want the data grade to accurately reflect your situation. If it does not, you're going to think your results are different than what they really are, and you might spend money in the wrong places and have a lot of problems. So make sure, can't stress enough, to be honest about what the data grade is. At the end, if you enter all of your data grades, you will get a water audit data validity score down at the bottom in red, and it will say a number out of 100. So this particular water audit got 49 out of 100. And it will also give priority areas for what you should improve if you want to have a higher validity score. You should note that the data grades do not have equal weight in calculating the validity score. So for example, the volume of own sources is a much, much higher weight than the number of miles of pipe in your system. So it's going to give you the 3 highest priority areas for you that if you wanted to work on something that would help your overall validity score, these are the 3 best places to go work. So volume from own sources is often up there, as is unbilled metered or customer meter inaccuracies, if you aren't doing a lot in those particular areas. So if the data validity score is low, generally 50 out of 100 is kind of a break point where we say you want to at least be 50 out of 100 before kind of move on. The response should be, let's work on our data first before we move on to spending a lot of money dealing with water losses or non-revenue water. So you want to remember the 3 V's, that the water audit will tell you the volume of water in different categories and the volume of water lost. It will give you values related to apparent losses and real losses, and it will also give you validity. The validity gear there is much bigger than value and volume because the validity is the most important. You don't really want to move on to value and volume until you've gotten your validity score up to where it needs to be. So even though results are provided, you don't want to move on to making decisions about your system until your data validity is a little bit higher. You're much better off to spend money improving your data validity first before you spend lots of big bucks doing very expensive things. So just to finish up, our last section is you've collected a lot of data. You know, what about just doing it? What are we going to do if we don't know if we have good data? I always say, even if you don't have any good data, you don't really know what's going on, go ahead and do a water audit anyway, because you have to start somewhere, and knowing where you are will help you figure out where to improve. And it isn't until you start looking at data grades and you start to see the various practices that matter that you can start to make a difference, and you can start to say, well, maybe I need to have a practice or a procedure in place in order to improve my validity. And this will help you figure out what you need to do. So don't worry about how you're doing, don't worry about how good your data is, just go ahead and get started. And then if you have a low validity score, that's where you'll spend the next year, maybe even 2 or 3, trying to improve your data validity before you go on to other activities. Another thing is the water audit is not as bad as it looks. It seems scary, but there's really only 13 volume inputs, 5 attribute inputs, 3 cost inputs, and 21 total places where you have to enter something. However, there's default values you can use. There are things that won't be applicable to your system. So the general system has maybe 10 to 15 inputs to deal with. So that's not so bad. So just remember, it's nowhere near as bad as it looks. And start with the data that you have and improve it over time. You won't know what to address until you kind of get started. If you take the time to do the water audit and check the data, there are definitely cost benefits to doing it because there's potential to gain revenue in areas where you've had lack of revenue, maybe due to bad metering, or you've been allowing somebody to not get a bill who maybe should have one. There's also reduction in costs if you don't have as much leaking out of your system and that sort of thing. So there's definite financial benefits to doing water audits and starting to take action to address the issues you have. And finally, don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. In your particular position within your utility, there may be limitations to what you can actually do, but don't let that stop you. At least do as much as you can, and then reach out and, to your billing people or your operators or whoever you need to reach out to try to make this better and to try to have more impact later. But at least start with doing what you can. We're definitely willing to work with you if you have questions or need help, so feel free to go online and fill out the form or to email us directly. And I think before we take a couple of questions, there may be a couple more poll questions that we're going to put up. So if you want to go ahead and put those last couple poll questions up.
Yes, so we have 2 questions before we take questions. Or 2 polls before we take questions. The first one is, if you are a small water system, are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? And Heather touched on this earlier. You can also go online to our website, efcnetwork.org, and fill out the form there for technical assistance. Or you can answer this poll and we will be reaching out to you. All right. And then our next poll question is just about the Environmental Finance Center blog. If you'd like to subscribe to the blog, just click yes here. We don't share these emails with anyone else. You would only be receiving emails about the blog. So if you're interested in that, definitely sign up here. And also, while Heather is taking questions, I'll be pushing out a link to a survey for today's webinar. If you have a chance, please take some time to tell us your thoughts on the webinar today. And if you don't have a chance to do so today, you will also receive this link in a follow-up email tomorrow, as well as information about where to locate the slides and a recording.
And just a reminder that if you haven't already submitted your question in the chat box, there's an opportunity for you to type in your question and it will come to us. So Dawn, have we had any questions submitted?
Yes, we have several. So the first question that we have is, if you do an audit, and then, so this is from the beginning of the webinar when you were talking about the instruction sheet. If you do an audit, then go into the instructions and change the units, will it update the report, for example, from million gallons to acre feet?
And the answer there is no. You're going to have to enter the data either as millions of gallons or enter it as acre feet. So you wouldn't just put the information in there and then have it all changed. You're going to have to do that yourself. So pick the units that you would like to be in, whether it's millions of gallons or acre feet, and then enter the data in those units. So typically, in the West, we use acre feet as a water rights kind of thing, and we talk about it maybe in our withdrawals from the wells. Sometimes we talk about acre feet, but most of the other stuff we do, we talk about gallons. So my recommendation is most of the time you're probably going to be wanting to use the units of millions of gallons rather than acre feet, but it is your option. You could do it in acre feet if you would like, but most of the other information you're going to have beyond your production meters is probably data that's in millions of gallons. So my suggestion is stick with millions of gallons, put everything in those units, and kind of use that as the basis for your audit.
And on that note, there's a question about the units being too large for small systems, that millions of gallons is too much. And I just wanted to kind of reinforce that the data is over the course of a year. So even for very small systems, over the course of a year, chances are the units are not too large. And Heather, I just give you a chance to kind of comment on that as well as to why there's not other units of choice in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, and I think that is correct. What Dawn is saying is correct, that most of the time for small utilities, even very small utilities, over the course of an entire year, you're going to have at least in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So if it turns out that you're not actually in the millions of gallons, like say you're 800,000, you're going to be putting in 0.8 instead of, so you put 0.8 in there. And most of the time, even the very small utilities will at least be in the low end of millions of gallons, both for their production and for the customers sold. So it's not going to be too big of a problem, but some of you may be in that range where you're using point something, where you're using like 0.2 for 200,000 gallons, or you're using 0.1 for 100,000 gallons. So yes, there can be some cases where the value is a little on the low side, but typically, over the course of a year, millions of gallons is not that bad of a value to choose. But it doesn't hurt if you believe that it'd be better to also have maybe thousands of gallons as a potential unit. AWWA is always willing to accept comments, and you're free to submit a comment like that to the AWWA Water Loss Audit Committee and suggest that maybe there should be another option to use thousands of gallons instead of millions of gallons if you're a small system. So that's something that I recommend if you think a better, there's a better unit to use, go ahead and submit to them, and the committee will take a look at it. Every couple of years they do updates to the software, and maybe they'll consider changing that in the future. Dawn, are you still there?
Seems as though we may have lost Dawn. It's kind of answer or say some of these questions, and if Dawn comes back, she can start fielding them again. But so the next question we have is, water sold to utilities considered water exported?
Yes, if it's water that you sell in bulk to another utility, that would be water exported. So it's not water to your individual customers, but perhaps you sell to a neighboring utility and then they distribute it to their customers. That would be considered water exported. So typically you'll have like a bulk meter and you're selling it to a neighboring utility, and that would be considered water exported.
All right. The next question we have is, what is the current per capita estimate for water use?
That's a really good question. It's actually changing. We always used to use the value of 100 gallons per capita per day. And I must admit, I don't know the exact value that people have accepted at this point, but I know it has dropped. So, out west, we're seeing it much closer to 60 to 70 gallons per capita per day. Back east, I'm hearing numbers that are more like 70 to 80 gallons per capita per day. But in the past, we'd always used about 100 gallons per capita per day as a pretty good estimate of usage, and that has dropped over time. And I have to apologize, I don't know if there's an exact number that's being used now that's sort of across the entire country in terms of what the new gallons per capita is, but I would suggest you check with your state because they may have a new estimate. And like I said, out west, we're seeing some pretty low gallons per capita per day as people are really getting into conservation. But even across the whole country, we've seen a drop as people use low-flow toilets and that kind of thing. We'll try to get an answer for you and send it out after the webinar, because off the top of my head, I don't know the exact answer to that question.
Okay, and I think Dawn is back. Dawn, can you hear us now? No? Okay. Well, that's all the questions we actually have at the moment. One more just came in, so we'll take this last one before we finish. What about businesses that use a large amount of water? So, for example, industrial businesses. Would this count as exported water?
Typically, we do not count that as exported water. That's just an industrial or a commercial customer. So we're not going to count those as water exported. They're just going to be in that customer base. Now, where that might come into play is when you look at your dollars per 1,000 gallons for the customer retail rate that you're going to put in there. Because if you have a large usage going to commercial customers and they're paying a different rate than residential customers, you're going to do a flow weighted average to try to figure out the one number to put in there. So let's say you're charging your residential customers $1.60 per 1,000 gallons, but you're charging your commercial customer $1.80 per 1,000 gallons. The fact that a lot of water is going to that commercial customer is going to raise the dollar per 1,000 gallons to maybe 1.7 or 1.75 when you do the flow weighted average. It could also go the other way if you charge your commercial customers less. Some people do that to try to attract businesses, and maybe they pay $1.20 per 1,000 gallons. So if a lot of water is going there, it will reduce the dollars per 1,000 gallons. But that's probably about the only place it's going to end up showing up is in that that particular category. The other place that will come in to play is if you're choosing meters to check in terms of accuracy, those large volume meters, the ones that a lot of flow is going through and a lot of revenue is going to come from, those would be great places to go to look for how accurate the meters are, because if they are reading incorrectly, there's a lot of revenue that you're losing. So that's the other place that you'll kind of look at those large commercial meters is, when you start to do meter testing, meter analysis, you're going to be looking for where you're going to get a big bang for your buck, and basically if that meter is reading wrong, that's a lot of revenue that you're losing. So those are kind of the two places, but normally that is not considered water exported. That's just part of the water that you supply to customers.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have questions for now. Any questions that did come in that weren't answered, we will follow up with you and make sure that those questions are answered for you. Thank you all for joining us today. Please fill out the survey that was posted in your chat box. And with any questions, you can follow up with Heather or Dawn, whose emails are on the screen right now. Have a great day.
Thank you all for coming.